Thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you. So I will launch in sort of more or less straight away to my little bit of, here we are. Here we go. So that should, I hope,
Yes, we can see that,
enable
Ellie.
you all to see that. Okay, so you were reading, or you were suggested that you might read the Bible and Ecology book by Richard Bauckham, and then Sharon suggested I might do about 15 or 20 minutes or so on the whole book, which was never going to happen. So I said, well, how about one chapter? The phrase community of creation's always been very attractive to me. I've always, kind of, um, yes, it's always been a meaningful concept to me, I suppose. So that's partly why I sort of lit in on that third chapter in the book. So all I'm going to do in the next 15 minutes or so is just kind of reflect a little bit with you about some of the things that come out of that. Yes, some of the things that Bauckham says, but also quite a lot of it is kind of my take on it. So I take responsibility for that bit. Don't blame Richard Bauckham if it's all upside down. So now, ooh, see if I can get the next slide. How do I do that? Should be able to move the slide on.
Do you have the advance arrows in the bottom right-hand corner of your keyboard, Ellie?
Yeah, doing.
It's not working.
No.
Can you use your
Oh, wait a minute.
mouse?
Yeah, I've got my mouse here. Here we are. That's no good. Um, oh.
They have
Uh,
changed a few things, haven't they?
yeah, they have, haven't they? I haven't done this for a little while. I'm sorry. I'll tell you what I'm gonna do. I'm going to jump out of this for a minute, and then I'm going to share a different version of it. I'm not going to mess about trying to get that to work. Let's go in here, which is always a bit clumsy. I'm sorry. Because you can then see what's
Yeah.
coming next, but at least I can show you what's coming next. So oh, I don't really want to show you that, but never mind. No, that's not do notes. That's it. That's not too bad. Okay. So one of the things that Barkham does as he thinks about the community of creation is to go in and to think about, he uses a number of passages from the Psalms. And I think this is important and relevant because it's important that we kind of get our heads around the fact that actually there's lots of stuff in the Bible about creation. It's not just all about Genesis 1. I will come back to Genesis 1 right at the end, but the Psalms have got masses of stuff about creation. And what's quite interesting is that the theology that is in the Psalms is not, well, it gives a slightly different slant, I think. And there are other passages as well, which Barkham looks at and which we will have a look at. So he quotes the whole of Psalm 104. All creation worships. O Lord, how manifold are your works. In wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. And there's lots more of that in Psalm 104. I've got a little bit more of Psalm 104 coming up. But as we kind of contemplate that with the psalmist, it immediately kind of brings up for us that question of, well, so what are we talking about when we're talking about what is creation? If all creation worships and the Lord has made everything, what exactly do we mean by the whole of creation? There's another thing here from a psalm. This is Psalm 8, which is another good creation psalm. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are humans that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? Come back to those few verses in a little while. And the sort of, as soon as we kind of stop and think about that, there's a few things there on the screen to sort of help you think about it. But rocks and soils, air, water, minerals, plants, animals, birds, the stars, and the people. The people fit into that, but actually creation and the whole community of creation is enormously wide. And it's that kind of question about what are we actually talking about and how do we relate to that community of creation, that whole thing of creation, that is what we're having a think about this evening. What has God created and where do we, humanity, fit in? Barkham, of course, as I said, quotes the whole of Psalm 104, or pretty much the whole of it, I think. And we haven't got time to look at the whole thing. So if you want to look at that, you can look at it in your own time. But this is just a couple of passages from that psalm that gives us a little bit of a perspective about what the psalmist was thinking about when they were thinking about God's creation and humanity in its place. I won't read the whole thing, but you make springs to gush forth in the valleys, they flow between the hills, giving drink to every wild animal. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle, plants for people to use, food, wine, oil to make the face shine, bread, and so on. And then it goes on to talk about these, meaning all these creatures, look to you, God, to give them their food in due season. So we've got something there about God's provision for this creation that he has made. He has then provided what is necessary to sustain that creation going forwards. When you give to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things, and so on. So just thinking about that, there are three things, I think, that we can draw out of that psalm and that passage. According to the psalmist, God has created everything in the cosmos. The plants, the birds, the animals, and us as human beings. So God has created all of that. We are all part of the whole of creation, the community of creation. As I said, everything, including human beings, is dependent on God for sustenance. When you open your hand, they're filled with good things. And then lastly, which I didn't point out on the previous slide, actually all things are created to give praise to God. The psalm starts, I'll just flick back. Bless the Lord, O my soul. O Lord, my God, you are very great. The psalmist is starting off and then goes on to sort of say, that human beings are part of creation and that the whole of creation is created to praise God, to bless God. Quick pause there, not a very long one. Very quick pause. Time for a comment, one comment or two comments. Anybody want to say anything about what a load of rubbish, or actually that all makes sense, or something in between?
Mike has his hand up, Elly.
Oh yes, yeah, carry on, Mike.
It's great what you said. I think it's all good, but as a scientist and as a realist and critical realist as well, as far as we're concerned, not all things are good to us. And I think we've got to remember in Genesis that the word good, the Hebrew word good, tov, I think it's called, is fit for purpose. harmonious. So everything is fit for purpose. But when we think it's good, it's not necessarily good for us. No one can convince me that the insect, as David Attenborough would say, the insect that has a larvae which actually penetrates your eyes and your body is actually good for us. But it is fit for purpose. We just don't know what that purpose ultimately is.
Yeah, absolutely. There's whole thing about purpose. When I was being taught eco-theology by somebody called David Reimer, one of the first things things he kept on coming back to is, so what do we do about the smallpox virus? You know, if we're going to say it's all good, smallpox virus, you know, and it absolutely, that's where it's, you know, it begins to get really tricky, doesn't it? Okay, let's carry on.
Thank you.
Let's carry on. There's something in that psalm about all things being created, the community of creation. One of the other places which also Bauckham quotes from is the book of Job, particularly from Job chapter 38. I don't know how many of you know the sort of overall story of the book of Job. It isn't one we often hear from in church, but Job is somebody who is living a sort of ideal life. He's a very devout man, and in true to a lot of Old Testament theology, because he is very devout, everything's going right in his life. He's wealthy, he's got lots of flocks, he's got a good family, he's got sons and daughters and grandchildren, and it's all wonderful. And the understanding is that it's all wonderful because he is a very good man and has a good relationship with God. And then suddenly the whole thing goes pear-shaped, and well, a bit more than that. And his flocks die. He himself gets ill, his children get ill, his house is knocked down, all sorts of dreadful things happen to him. And most of the book of Job is a sort of explaining all of this stuff. And there's a lot of stuff in there about, you've heard the phrase Job's comforters, I expect. His friends come round and say to him, well, you must have done something wrong, because all this stuff wouldn't be going wrong in your life if you hadn't done something terrible. And Job can't work out what it is that he's done. And in the end, Job questions God, and he says, look, God, I've done everything for you that I was ever taught you needed. I've just always been the person that I thought you wanted me to be, as it were. And yet all this stuff has gone wrong in my life. Why? And then we get to Job 38, and we get God's answer to Job. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Who determined its measurements? Who stretched the line upon it? Who shut in the sea with doors, and so on. And there's lots more, Job 38, and I think it goes on into Job 39 as well. In effect, God is saying to Job, partly, mostly, who are you to question me? But he does that through the medium of, just look around you at the amazing creation that you are part of, and tell me, Job, tell me, God, who is the creator of that. He's putting Job very firmly in his place. And in the process of doing that, we get the most amazing kind of creation theology being exposed in this this part of Job. It's God alone who has created the universe, and he puts Job in his place. God is God, and we are his people. Psalm 8, which we had a little bit of at the beginning. And again, this is reflecting on, here's creation, but where are human beings in God's creation? What is the place of human beings in God's creation? Giving a slightly different perspective, I suppose, on some of the other Psalms. when I look at your heavens and the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? So in a way, that's completely the opposite of what Job has been trying to say. God has been putting Job very firmly in his place. Here, the psalmist is putting himself before God and wondering at the fact that God should take any notice at all of human beings. But then he goes on to say, you, God, have given humanity dominion over the work of your hands. You have put all things under your feet, and the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, and so on. So there's a picture in there, isn't there, of the relationships between God and the created beasts and human beings. There's a differentiation between humanity and the rest of creation. And human beings in this reading have a special place in God's creation, which the psalmist is trying to sort of grapple with. Then we remember, of course, Genesis 1, which is where we often start with when we're thinking about creation theology. But as I've been trying to show, there's lots of other stuff. There's Job, there's the Psalms, and in fact, there are lots of other places through the Bible where you find the writer's take on creation theology. What's all this creation thing about? And we have here God telling humanity, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and so on. And of course, that word dominion, I'm sure you've heard discussed many times. So it begs the question, if human beings, well, firstly, do human beings have a special place within the community of creation? And if they do have a special place, what does that mean? How does that work? And I've got on this slide and the next one, 3 possible ways of thinking about the relationships between God, humanity, and nature. How do those relationships work within the community of creation? And on the left of that slide, we've got a sort of triangle where we have, which sort of represents the fact that God and nature have a two-way relationship, God and humanity have a two-way relationship, and humanity and nature have a two-way relationship. Most of that is most of what we've sort of dipped into as far as the biblical witness is concerned would be consistent with that one. On the right-hand side, we've got a rather different sort of model. We've got a rather more hierarchical model, something that I suppose that some of the passages from Psalm 8 might kind of lean towards, where you've got humanity being a little lower than the angels, lower than God, but humanity having dominion over, ruling over nature. That one's a little bit more problematical to my mind because it's hierarchical, but it's also gives the impression that maybe nature can only sort of communicate, the relationship of God with nature is sort of mediated through humanity, if you like. And of course, that doesn't make any sense as far as science is concerned, to say nothing of actually most of the biblical witness. Doesn't make any sense as far as science is concerned, because humanity's only been around for a tiny proportion of the time that nature's been around. So the idea that God might have a relationship directly with nature, as the left-hand one shows, would, to my mind, be a more acceptable one. But that one on the right-hand side there is something that some parts of Scripture might lead us towards. And then the third way we might want to think about this relationships is what I might describe as something that kind of springs out of deep ecology, where humanity is simply part of nature. Humanity relates to God in the same way as nature relates to God, or indeed, looking at this diagram, humanity might even relate to God through nature, and that human beings are basically exactly the same as a worm, an ant, a virus, or whatever, that we are equally valuable. There's nothing more special about us than there is about, for example, the smallpox virus. That is not a model that is supported by the scriptural witness, but it is something that, as I say, that's the sort of more of a deep ecology kind of model that you might see in other places. So far, we've looked at scripture from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. But of course, Bauckham also uses this passage from the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to read the whole thing again because of timings, but there's the piece there. Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow; they neither toil nor spin. I have to say that I think the theology, creation theology in the New Testament is rather more implicit than it is in the Old Testament. That there's a sort of assumption that people knew all the Hebrew Bible, and therefore Jesus was building on that. He didn't need to explain it again. So it's a bit more implied, which means you have to sort of dig for it a little bit. But then Bauckham goes on to comment about that passage. A couple of comments here, a couple of quotes here. Jesus draws on the creation theology of the Hebrew Bible in order to teach his disciples the kind of lifestyle that is appropriate to living in such a world, the world of God's generous extravagance in which God provides abundantly for all his creatures. And then he also talks on that quote on the right-hand side about anxiety and about worry, the human anxiety about having enough to survive. For most people, that's long been superseded by the drive to ever-increasing affluence, the obsessive anxiety to maintain an ever-rising standard of living, and of course the damage that does to the resources of nature. If you put those two things side by side, I mean, you can see where that springs out of the quote from Matthew, but you can also see how challenging those two are, just to us, really. So to summarize, the Bible teaches us a great deal about how we are all a part of God's community of creation. We've looked especially at the Psalms, and there's lots more, but there is in other places as well, like, for example, in Job. Human beings do have a special place, but it's a place of responsibility rather than for privilege. And again, I think you can get that from those the wording in the Psalms. And both human beings and nature have their own relationship of love with God. That God has a relationship with nature, which we are kind of outside of, if you like. And we have a relationship with nature. Because the problem is, if you look at that triangle, the problem is if you chop the top of the triangle off, which is what a lot of people do, you get the relationship between humanity and nature, but God kind of gets forgotten. And there's, that tends to be what often happens in non-Christian, non-religious circles.